Okay, so we're getting into part 2 of chapter 6 right now. We've already covered epithelial and nervous tissue, and now we're going to talk about connective and muscular. So again, we're going to hit on the slide a bunch of times this semester, but you really need to think big picture here, right? So how structure, function, and location kind of work together to give you a full insight of the tissue, or really whatever we're looking at that particular time. And so for the tissues right now, how does simple one layer, how to stratify layers, how does that dictate the function that it's going to perform, and then the end result, how does that lead you to figure out the location that you're gonna find it. Okay, so connective tissue really is kind of the opposite of the epithelial tissue in a lot of ways. If you guys remember that epithelial tissue has a high cellular to matrix ratio, connective tissue is the opposite. It has mostly matrix or structure with just a few cells located within it. Right? And so the epithelial tissue, the analogy we gave was that it's a bunch of people shoved into a phone booth. For the connective tissue, it's kind of like a geodome at Burning Man with just a couple people hanging out in it. Right? The geodome is mostly structure and the people, there's a few cells kind of floating about in there, all right? And it's really the same thing. You're really dealing with mostly connecting things, or mostly providing structures or points of attachment for other tissues, all right? So we're really going to cover just fibrous connective tissue in this lab. We do get into cartilage and bone later. We don't do blood in this 201. So again, we're really just going to focus on the 6 types of fibrous connective tissue. And fibrous connective tissue can be broken up into 2 main parts: dense connective, which is really kind of tight-knit tissue with really this open space is filled with fibers of one type or another. Right? And so you have dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic all fall under that category. While loose connective is really you have gel or more open space between the fibers in that type of tissue. And there's 3 types that fall under that categorization: reticular, areolar, and adipose. So we're going to start with dense regular, and really what that is it's really strong in one plane, kind of just as that animation shows you. It's really good in resisting tension in that X plane, for example. And so a good example of a location you might find it are ligaments or tendons, right? So your ACL, for example, your anterior cruciate ligament, that's really good at resisting tension in one plane, the Y plane. And that's why it's also one of the most commonly torn ligaments in sports injuries for football or soccer, things like that. It's because you're putting a X stress on a ligament that's designed to respond in Y. So you're putting a lateral strain on this tendon or this ligament, and it tears, right? And so it's kind of nice to think about, okay, the structural organization of tendons comes from the tissue that it's made of, which is dense regular, and the organization of dense regular are pretty much parallel collagen fibers, right? And so it's really good at holding bones together and muscles to bones, but not so good at resisting tension in a wide range of planes or directions. You compare that to something like dense irregular, right, which is really good at resisting tension in multiple directions. And you find dense irregular pretty much underneath the dermis. It attaches the dermis to the hypodermis and to underlying tissues, areolar and some other ones as well. But it's really good at resisting tension in multiple directions. So if you pull on your skin, right, you can realize it doesn't matter which way you pull on it, it always kind of snaps back to that same position. A lot of that comes from the structural integrity of dense irregular tissue, where you have these irregularly organized collagen fibers. All right, and the last type of dense connective tissue is elastic tissue. And what really kind of defines elastic tissue are elastin fibrin. All right, so this protein, these elastic fibers, that kind of intermingle within the tissue, right? And so the key to elasticity is not so much stretching, but recoil, right? So the ability to maintain that shape. And so, as you might expect, the parts of your body that are expanding and recoiling on a daily basis, such as your heart and your lungs and arteries, you see elastic tissue associated with them, right? And so you really want to be able to maintain those shapes because they're pretty important, right? So, I think it looks like pastrami when you're looking at it. You kind of have that dark red coloring with the black elastin intermingled or sparsed or mixed about. Okay, so we're going to move to loose connective tissue, and in there we're going to start with reticular tissue. And reticular tissue, again, is like all the other loose connective tissues. You're going to see a little bit more open space. When you look at dense regular or you looked at dense irregular, you could tell that there was collagen fibers. It's really packed in there. There's not a lot of open space. And with reticular tissue, it's kind of, we're getting to be more spread out. And I like to think of it like a grapefruit bag in terms of the framework or the structure that it's going to provide, right? So if you take all the grapefruits out of that bag, it's not going to be able to really support anything, or there's not going to be much to it. But when you put the grapefruits in, you have a defined shape to it, and that's what happens with reticular tissue, is that you're forming a framework around soft organs, and the shape of those organs are really dictating the shape of that reticular tissue. What's really nice about that bag, right, is it allows stuff to be filtered through, so you could wash those grapefruits with a hose if you wanted to. And it's really a similar concept with reticular tissue in the sense that stuff can be filtered in and out of it. And that's what it allows for, and that's where you see it. You see it with organs that filter things like the liver and the spleen and lymph nodes. Things are getting secreted and filtered through, so it's nice to have a supportive framework that allows for that. And so the key structures within here are these kind of nematode or worm-looking things that are called the reticular fibers, and then organ cells, which also kind of almost look like speckles or seeds intermixed. Okay, so next up is areolar tissue. Just like the name suggests, it means open space, and there's a lot of open areas with areolar tissue, and it's kind of, you have a collagen, you have elastic fibers, you have these mast cells which kind of support the structures in a way, and really you find this all over the body. It pretty much attaches all epithelia to other structures or to lower layers, and you often find it surrounding organs. And so it's basically forming this framework that's allowing nerves and blood vessels to pass through while still maintaining some sort of connection between tissues. And the last type of connective tissue is adipose tissue, also fat. You're dealing with energy storage, cushioning, insulation, all these types of functions. And you find this again in all sorts of areas throughout the body, underneath the dermis, around organs, anything that's really, it's hard to find a spot where it's not located within the body. Right? And so the characteristics that you're looking for are these kind of wide open vacuoles, and they used to be filled with some substance, but the slide prep, when they cut it open, all that stuff kind of leaks away, and all you're left is with this big open space with this nucleus that kind of looks like a watermelon seed pushed all the way to the side. All right, so far we've talked about epithelial, we talked about nervous, and we talked about connective. The last tissue we're going to talk about is muscular tissue, which is detailed in table 6.3. Right? And so there's a couple functions besides just movement. It's also helping to facilitate blood moving through a vessel, an important source of generating body heat. And there's three main types we talk about: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. We're going to start with skeletal, which is kind of the classic tissue that you think about when you think muscles. All right, so your biceps, your pecs, your quadriceps, those are all made up of skeletal muscle. And some of the characteristics of skeletal muscle that are kind of defining are that it's visibly striated. So you can see in the images where those striations or those, it almost looks like a reverb going out throughout the cell. They're also multinucleate, meaning that there's a bunch of nuclei per cell. Like each cell, which is called a fiber in skeletal muscle, can really stretch several feet in length. So you need nuclei throughout the entire length of that cell to help support it. And so, again, skeletal muscles, the locations, typical area of a muscle. Again, the function is dealing with voluntary contractions. And it's important to note that it can look very different depending on the view that you're seeing, right? So right now we're showing you a transverse and a longitudinal. If you look at the transverse, it's kind of looking at the ends of a pencil, right? So you've kind of cut through and you're looking head on at the erasers. And what you're seeing, these bundles of fibers set together, you can kind of see how each fiber or cell has a bunch of nuclei there. You can't really see the striations from this view, but you get the idea. This is really kind of unique to skeletal muscle. And then you compare that to the longitudinal view, you can kind of see the Dalmatian look with the multiple nuclei, and you can see the striations a little bit better. Cardiac muscle, just as you might guess, you find in the heart. You're dealing with involuntary contractions of the heart, right? So you really don't have a lot of control over your heart rate. You can't think to contract your heart at a certain rate. It has to respond to certain stimuli. All right, so as cells in skeletal muscle are called fibers, the cells in cardiac are called myocytes, right? So myocardiac infarction is a heart attack, and myo, just the root of it, means heart. So if you look at the structure of it, it's branched, it's relatively short, especially compared to skeletal muscle, and it has striations similar to skeletal. And the really big thing to note out are those brown markings, which are intercalated discs. And those really connect myocytes to each other and really make the whole process efficient and allows the electrical signal or the information to be passed very effectively, right? So you want your heart to pretty much contract rhythmically and in tune. So the intercalated discs allow those cells to communicate better, right? And another thing to note is that there's only one cell per myocyte. All right, here's another image. You can see the intercalated disc, you can see the nuclei, you can see that they're branched. And you can also see the striations. Last one we're talking about is smooth muscle, which is relatively short. It's dealing with involuntary contractions. They're spindly. There's one nuclei per cell, which are also called fibers, just like skeletal muscle in this case. And you find them in areas that you wish you had a little bit more control over sometimes, but your GI tract, arteries. And another good place to think about is in your pupil, right? So when your pupils dilate, or they, if you've been drinking too much and they do, a police officer pulls you over and they flash that light in your eye, what they're looking for is basically that involuntary muscle, that smooth muscle that's attached to your pupil, to see how it is affected. Right? So alcohol is going to suppress it, and it's going to affect that response. So it's a way that you can't control, but it's kind of an indication of drunkenness, I guess. So again, the location is going to be on the GI tract, arteries, and the pupil. You're going to be dealing with involuntary contraction, often sustained contractions such as moving food through the system, birth. And these things are pretty nondescript. They're going to be kind of that spindly shaped, one nuclei, no striations. Okay, so just to recap, let's look at, or keep in mind, the relationships between structure, function, location. It's going to make it way easier to remember this stuff of what does what. Break it down to its most basic root, the basic shape, the basic number of layers, the basic structures that are affiliated with it, and then build on that. You can usually figure out what's the best function and then where the best location would be from there. Right? And important to look at and keep in mind is that, you know, we looked at labs in lab 2 and lab 3. We kind of started thinking about how different planes or different cuts affect or why they're important. And so here's a perfect example, right? So we have a mid-sagittal cut in orange and then a parasagittal in blue. They're all parts of the egg, but the blue, the parasagittal cut, is totally missing in the nucleus. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind, that if you're looking at a slide, make sure that you peruse or cruise around that slide a little bit to really figure out what's going on. All right, and so just a couple reminders as you guys are kind of getting into drawings and staying hopefully on top of that stuff. Make sure that everything's labeled appropriately. Make sure that they're clear, that you have magnification, make sure that you spell everything right, and make sure you do good drawings. Take your time. We definitely encourage you guys to just spend like 15-20 minutes every day drawing that. It'll just make life a lot easier. And don't be shy about cracking open that DVD and using some of the images included there.